She was barely 13 when she gave birth. She survived wars, betrayals, and whispered conspiracies. This is not the story of a warrior queen. It is the story of a girl bartered like a coin, broken before she understood love, forced into a marriage she did not choose, widowed while still a child. She endured agony that left her scarred for life. And yet, from that fragile body came a dynasty that would reshape the realm, the Tudor dynasty. Take a moment to settle in. Let the noise of the day fade away, and allow yourself to drift into the quiet. Make sure to subscribe if you're drawn to mysteries, to stories of power, betrayal, and survival, told in a calm and haunting voice. Here, we wander through the shadows of the past, where forgotten voices whisper, and the line between truth and legend fades. The walls of Pembroke Castle shook with her screams. The midwives whispered prayers, and outside the wind lashed against the stone. When the child finally cried out, the sound was so fragile that it might have been mistaken for a dying bird. Yet in that cry lay the future of England. 15th century England was a place of suspicion and ambition. Roses bloomed red and white on fields, churned by battle. Daggers glinted in smoky halls. In the middle of this chaos, a child named Margaret Beaufort became the most dangerous piece on the board. How did she survive? How did she shape destiny in a world that saw her only as a vessel to be used? The year was 1443. England was restless and bleeding. The 100 Years' War had drained the kingdom and humbled the crown. King Henry VI was gentle and devout, but unsuited for the brutal world of politics. His weakness invited wolves. Two houses, both descended from Edward III, prepared to fight. Lancaster clung to Henry's fragile authority. York burned with the conviction that their claim was purer. Between them, the kingdom cracked like ice. In this fractured land, at Bletsoe Castle in Bedfordshire, a baby girl was born. Margaret Beaufort's father, John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, carried royal blood, but also the taint of illegitimacy. Her mother, Margaret Beauchamp, was an heiress. When her father died, whispers said by his own hand, Margaret was barely a year old. She inherited vast estates, and with them, the attention of powerful men. No longer a child in their eyes, she was land, gold, and a claim to the throne. While men slaughtered each other over crowns, the most dangerous claim to power was hidden in the body of a girl who hadn't yet grown into womanhood. At 12, Margaret was married to Edmund Tudor, half-brother of the king. The year was 1455. The Wars of the Roses had just begun. To Edmund, she was not a child. She was property and blood. Picture her in a cold chapel, vows in Latin she couldn't understand, heavy cloth dragging on her narrow shoulders. The men around her nodded not at her bravery, but at the contract completed. There was no time for innocence. Edmund consummated the marriage immediately, pressing the weight of dynastic ambition onto a body barely ripened by childhood. The vows were in Latin. She didn't understand the words, but her body understood the weight. From that night on, it no longer belonged to her. Her childhood ended in silence and blood. The union would claim more than her body. It would almost take her life. The marriage bed was not a sanctuary, but a prison. Margaret, scarcely more than a child, moved like a shadow through Edmund Tudor's household. The corridors smelled of wax and damp stone. The chapel echoed with words she barely understood, and always there was the weight of expectation pressing down upon her narrow shoulders. She tried to cling to the remnants of girlhood. Tiny stitches on her embroidery frame whispered prayers for her mother. But the sound of footsteps outside her chamber was enough to still her hands. Edmund entered not as a companion but as a claimant, each night an assertion that she was his vessel, his promise of heirs. The court looked upon her not with pity but with calculation. She was no longer a girl. She was womb and inheritance, a fragile chalice in which dynasties might be poured. In her silence, she learned the first lesson of power. Her body was not her own, but her endurance could one day become a weapon sharper than any blade. Fate struck quickly. Within a year, Edmund Tudor was captured by Yorkist forces and died of plague. Margaret, scarcely 13, was widowed and pregnant. She sought shelter with Jasper Tudor at Pembroke Castle, perched on a rocky headland above a river, its keep rising like a spear, Wogan's cave yawning beneath as if the earth itself harboured secrets. It was here, on a winter night in January 1457, that she was led into the birthing chamber. The chamber smelled of herbs and smoke. Candles guttered in the cold. Her body was too slight, her hips too narrow. Hours became an eternity. The birth tore her apart so violently that she would never bear another child. Yet out of that broken body came a boy whose cry would echo across a century of blood. He was named Henry. Margaret survived, but she was permanently scarred. A widow and a mother at 13, she would never again have another child. That fragile infant would one day fracture kingdoms. England devoured itself. In 1461, the Battle of Towton turned snow into a canvas of slaughter. 65,000 men clashed in a blizzard. By dusk, 28,000 corpses lay stiff on the ground, red roses and white alike drowned in crimson. The Yorkists triumphed. Henry VI was toppled. Margaret, still in her teens, sought safety. In 1458 she married Sir Henry Stafford. It was strategy, not love. His loyalty to the Yorkists offered her a shield. For over a decade she lived in uneasy peace at Woking Palace, while her son remained with Jasper Tudor. She learned to smile when required and bow when expected, but every gesture of loyalty was a mask. She bent her knee to kings she secretly prayed would choke on their own crowns. Behind the veil of obedience, she sharpened patience into a weapon. Years of uneasy peace became her crucible. At Woking Palace, Margaret lived beside Henry Stafford in a quiet marriage that was more treaty than love. The Yorkist banners hung over the great hall. Loyalty to Edward IV was demanded daily, spoken as naturally as grace before meals. She smiled when required, bowed when expected, and learned the language of survival. Obedience on the surface and resistance in the heart. Banquets turned into rehearsals for deception. She curtsied as Yorkist lords recounted the fall of her allies, her lips curved in a practiced smile, while her thoughts burned like coals. In the gardens she found her discipline. Each trimmed hedge, each rose cut at the stem reminded her of how swiftly beauty was destroyed in this kingdom. She hid a true heart in prayer and piety, perfecting the art of seeming harmless. Those who underestimated her saw only a quiet lady at her devotions. They never noticed how she listened, remembered, and sharpened patience into a blade. In 1470, the Lancastrians briefly returned to power. Margaret saw her son again, but only for a moment. At Barnet and Tewkesbury, the Yorkists struck back and slaughtered Henry VI and his heir. Only Margaret's boy remained. Jasper Tudor fled with Henry to Brittany in 1471. Margaret stood on the shore at Tenby. The salt wind stung her eyes as she watched the sails vanish into the mist. To others it was exile. To her it was a coronation rehearsed in silence. She would not see him again for 14 years. Weeks later, her husband Henry Stafford died of wounds. Margaret, 28, was widowed once more. Her son was gone, her husband dead. Her cause extinguished, or so it seemed. Alone, she hardened grief into steel. Each wave had carried her boy further away, but she believed it carried him closer to his crown. In 1472, Margaret married Thomas Stanley, one of England's most calculating lords. It was a pact of survival. He gained her lands. She gained his protection. She entered Yorkist court draped in obedience. She carried Queen Elizabeth Woodville's train, smiled at Edward IV, and later served Queen Anne Neville under Richard III. Outwardly loyal, inwardly venomous. By day she curtsied. By night she wrote letters under flickering candles. Her ink was poison. She cultivated allies, arranged marriages, and turned her estates into weapons disguised as wealth. She perfected the mask, saintly servant above, conspirator beneath. She bent her knee to kings she secretly prayed would choke on their own crowns. By the 1470s, Margaret had become more than a widow and more than a dutiful wife. She was a strategist cloaked in velvet. At court, she carried Queen Elizabeth Woodville's train with serene devotion. Behind closed doors, She bent over letters by candlelight, the scratch of her quill drowned by the hiss of tallow. Her words travelled farther than her footsteps. Sealed messages hid beneath layers of wax, tucked into rosaries or sewn into hems. Priests carried confessions that were not prayers but plots. Merchants brought not spices but whispers. Each ally she cultivated was a thread. Each thread bound tighter around the future she envisioned for her son. She never allowed the mask to slip. To Edward IV she was loyal. To Richard she was meek. But in the silence of her chamber, she rehearsed betrayals as other women rehearsed lullabies. The world saw a saint. She was becoming an architect of rebellion. In 1483, Richard III seized the throne after declaring his nephews illegitimate. The princes vanished into the tower. Silence suffocated the kingdom. Margaret seized the moment. She forged a pact with Elizabeth Woodville, the boy's mother. Two former enemies bound by a single necessity: to overthrow Richard and unite red and white. They plotted to marry Henry Tudor to Elizabeth of York. Messages travelled hidden in sleeves, sealed with wax. Richard thought her locked away, but walls cannot hold ink, and her ink was treason. When the Duke of Buckingham rebelled that autumn, her shadow was upon it. The rising failed. Buckingham lost his head. Richard stripped her titles and confined her in Stanley's house. But even as a prisoner, she conspired. Stanley, always weighing his own gain, let her plot while he waited for the winds to shift. Richard thought he had silenced her, but the walls could not hold her pen, and her words became a weapon sharper than any sword. The summer of 1485 arrived like a storm. Henry Tudor landed in Wales with a band of exiles and French mercenaries. Richard III gathered a mightier host. On 22nd August at Bosworth Field, mud sucked at boots and men sank into marshes. The crown was no longer a symbol of right, but of survival. Richard charged directly at Henry. His sword cleaved through Henry's standard-bearer. The pretender was within reach. Henry's life was measured in heartbeats. And then Stanley moved. Betrayal crashed like thunder. His troops struck Richard's flank. The king was dragged from his horse, surrounded, hacked down. The crown fell in the mud, heavy with blood. It was lifted not by destiny, but by betrayal, and carried straight into her son's hands. Stanley set it on Henry's head. Her decades of silence, patience, and blood had reached a brutal crescendo. The boy she nearly died to bring into the world was king. Henry VII honoured his mother with unprecedented power. Parliament named her My Lady the King's Mother, granting her the independence of a female soul. Rare freedom for any woman. She vowed chastity and lived apart from Stanley, dedicating herself to faith and control. She became a shadow queen, shaping policy, arranging marriages, raising her grandchildren with Elizabeth of York. She founded legacies in stone and ink, refounding God's house as Christ's College in 1505 and beginning St. John's College. She invested wealth in scholarship and piety. Erasmus praised her generosity, but behind it lay the steel of a politician. She had survived by patience. Now she used power openly. In April 1509, Henry VII lay dying. He entrusted the kingdom to his mother, confident she would ensure a smooth succession. She orchestrated his funeral and the coronation of Henry VIII. 2 months later, on the 29th of June, she died, one day after her grandson's 18th birthday. She was buried in Westminster Abbey, beneath stone carved with her portcullis emblem. Her life had been forged in pain, her body broken young, yet she reshaped England more completely than kings who brandished swords. Margaret Beaufort's legacy is not simple. History calls her pious, gentle, devout, but the truth lingers like smoke. Did she merely survive, or did she shape kings? The Tudor age sprang from the agony of her body and the iron of her will. The bells of Westminster tolled for the death of Henry VII. The kingdom trembled with uncertainty, yet one figure remained steady at its heart: Margaret Beaufort. Though age had bowed her frame, her will was unbroken. She alone carried the authority to guide England through the storm of succession. In April 1509, she orchestrated the funeral of her son with the precision of a general. No detail escaped her eye. The order of the lords, the cloth of state, the measured prayers. And when the young Henry VIII ascended the throne, it was his grandmother's hand that placed order into chaos. The court whispered of his golden beauty, his athletic vigor, his promise of glory. Margaret saw more. She saw fire barely contained by ceremony, the dangerous hunger of a boy raised to believe he was chosen. To others, Henry's coronation was the dawn of an age. To Margaret, it was a reminder that crowns are both ornaments and burdens, and that even the brightest dawn casts shadows. As she watched him receive the acclamation of the people, she knew her work was ending. She had carried her son to his throne. Now her grandson stood on a precipice she could no longer guard. Her breath grew shorter, her body frailer, but her mind remained fixed on the one word that had ruled her life: dynasty. By summer of that year, Margaret lay dying. The stones of Westminster Abbey awaited her, carved with her emblem, the portcullis, the mark of her endurance. But her true legacy lived elsewhere. In Cambridge, the chapels of Christ's College and the foundations of St. John's still echoed with prayers she had endowed. Students traced letters on parchment, unaware that their patroness had once been a child forced to wed before she understood the meaning of vows. Every book copied, every candle lit for study, was a thread she had woven into the fabric of England. Her influence did not vanish with her last breath. It lingered in laws she had shaped, marriages she had arranged, and in the crown that glittered upon her grandson's head. She had been dismissed as pious, obedient, meek. Yet beneath that mask, she had been a strategist, a conspirator, a survivor who turned silence into her greatest weapon. Margaret Beaufort did not ride into battle, nor did she brandish a sword. She carved her dynasty from endurance, patience, and unyielding faith. When her coffin was lowered into the abbey, it was not merely a burial. It was the interment of England's most relentless architect, a woman who had remade a realm by wielding the quietest of tools: resolve, ink, and time. A girl once treated as a bargaining chip became the architect of a dynasty. Her story is one of survival and transformation. She reminds us that endurance can become power, patience can forge legacies, and silence can disguise revolution. If the silence of the tower unsettles you, if the mud of Bosworth still echoes in your mind, join us again. History leaves us with more questions than answers. Margaret Beaufort's life reminds us that power often hides in unexpected places, sometimes in the silence of a cloister, sometimes in the endurance of a broken child who outlived kings. If this journey stirred your curiosity, I invite you to stay with us. Here, we uncover the hidden corners of the past, where every whisper, every shadow, carries a story. Share your thoughts below, and if you'd like more stories where history is stranger, darker, and more fascinating than fiction, remember to subscribe. Your next quiet journey into the past is only a heartbeat away.